Grok 4 is smarter than almost all graduate students. Pick anything, and we're talking about questions that it's never seen before. These are not on the internet. The reasoning capabilities of Grok are incredible.
There is a Bible that most Christians have never seen in their lives. It is older than the Roman Catholic Church itself. It holds books that were cut from every Western edition ever printed. For 1,600 years, monks in one of the most remote places on earth guarded its pages with their lives. But now, artificial intelligence has recently scanned those pages and found something that left the world's top scholars completely speechless. The machine that read the oldest Bible. In June of 2025, a team of researchers from the University of Groningen published a study that sent quite shockwaves through the academic world. They had built an artificial intelligence tool designed to analyze ancient handwriting at a level of detail no human eye could ever manage alone. The tool could detect the microscopic angles of individual letters, the pressure of each pen stroke, and the invisible signatures that human hands leave behind, even 2,000 years after they are gone. They named it Enoch. Using this system, the team began redating manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls and found something that forced scholars to rewrite their timelines. Many of these ancient documents were up to 100 years older than previously believed. Some of the fragments date all the way back to the 4th century before the Common Era, making them among the oldest surviving religious texts ever discovered by modern science. Lead researcher Mladen Popovic described it this way. He said the Enoch tool had opened a new door into the ancient world, like a time machine that allows us to study the very hands that wrote the Bible. That is not a small statement. That is a scientist saying that artificial intelligence has brought humanity closer to the original source of Scripture than any discovery in the modern era. But the detail that stopped everyone cold was this. The texts that the Enoch AI was most precisely validating, the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, were texts that had been completely lost to the Western world for close to 2,000 years. The reason humanity still had these texts at all had nothing to do with technology, archaeology, or Western scholarship. It had everything to do with a single Christian nation in the highlands of East Africa that had silently refused to let them disappear. While Rome condemned, edited, and eventually forgot these books entirely, one country kept copying them by hand in a dying language generation after generation, for an audience they would never live to see. The artificial intelligence was named after a book that Africa saved. And that is only where this story begins. The Bible with more books than the world was told. When most people pick up a Bible today, they are holding 66 books. That is the version familiar to most Protestant Christians and the version printed and distributed across most of the Western world. The Catholic Bible adds 7 more books, bringing the total to 73. But inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the Bible has 81 books. That is 22 more than what most of the world has ever seen. Among them is the Book of Enoch, 108 chapters long, written centuries before the birth of Christ. There is the Book of Jubilees, which retells the entire story of Genesis with additional detail about the nature of angels, divine law, and sacred time. There are 3 books called Maccabean, entirely different from any text the Western world has ever canonized, written in the ancient language of Ge'ez with no equivalent anywhere else on earth. There is also the Book of the Covenant, known in Ge'ez as Mashafa Kidan, which presents itself as the direct teachings of Jesus during the 40 days between his resurrection and his ascension. 40 complete days of instruction that never appear in any Western Bible, in which Jesus speaks as both teacher and king, warning his followers that the most dangerous figures of the future would wear crosses and build great glittering buildings while caring absolutely nothing for the spirit inside them. Scholar Brooke Asale, writing in the Bible Translator in 2016, described the Ethiopian canon as neither open nor closed, meaning it carries a living quality unlike the sealed and standardized lists familiar to Western Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has stated directly on its own website that the entire Christian world owes a debt of gratitude to Ethiopia for preserving these documents. To understand how Ethiopia held on to these texts while everyone else let them go, you have to understand what Ethiopia actually is in the timeline of world Christianity. The men who kept writing. When the world stopped listening, the kingdom of Axum accepted the Christian faith around the year 330 of the Common Era. That makes it one of the very first Christian nations in human history, established before the Roman Catholic Church existed in any formal sense. King Ezana of Axum was the first ruler in recorded history to engrave the cross on a coin, and he did this before most of Europe had heard the name of Christ in any meaningful way. When Muslim conquests swept through the Middle East and North Africa in the 7th century, Ethiopia was cut off from the rest of the Christian world almost entirely. For hundreds of years, it survived in near total isolation, surrounded by different faiths and reachable only through mountains, deserts, and sea. And in that isolation, something completely irreversible happened. The Ethiopian Church was never subjected to the doctrinal cleanups and standardizing councils that reshaped Christianity in Europe and the Mediterranean. It simply kept reading the same books it had always read. Deep in the Tigray highlands at Abba Garima Monastery, monks have preserved what may be the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts ever to survive on Earth. When war reached the Tigray region in November of 2020, monks carried these manuscripts out of the monastery for the first time in any recorded period of history, holding them in leather bags as they fled into the night. One monk said that if the Gospels were lost, it would mean the people themselves were lost. Every word inside them was written in Ge'ez, an ancient South Semitic language that stopped being spoken sometime around the 10th century, and exists today only inside church liturgy and manuscript culture. Its writing system has 182 unique characters. Ethiopian monks spent entire lifetimes mastering it just to copy texts one generation older than themselves. They did it without institutional funding, without academic recognition, and without any certainty that the outside world would ever care. The most extraordinary document they preserved was one that the Western Church had not just ignored, it had actively tried to erase. The book quoted in your Bible that your Bible removed, the Book of Enoch, was not always treated as dangerous. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, it was discussed favorably by some of the most significant figures in the faith. Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, and Justin Martyr all wrote positively about it. And the New Testament letter of Jude quotes it directly and without any hesitation. Jude verses 14 and 15 contain a word-for-word citation from Enoch, chapter 1, verse 9, about the Lord coming with tens of thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment on all. The author of Jude calls Enoch the seventh from Adam, a detail drawn not from the book of Genesis, but from within the book of Enoch itself. This means a book that was later removed from the Bible is the source material for a passage still sitting inside the Bible that the Western world reads today. The Book of Enoch is 108 chapters organized into 5 sections. The most famous tells the story of the Watchers, 200 angels who descended to earth, took human wives, and fathered a race of giants. One fallen angel named Azazel taught humanity to forge weapons and use vanity to corrupt them. God commanded the archangel Gabriel to bind Azazel by his hands and feet and cast him into darkness until the final judgment. That is the origin story for evil that the Western Bible never included. The second section introduces the title Son of Man as a messianic figure on a throne of glory. Biblical scholars consider this the first appearance of that phrase in all of Jewish literature. predating the Gospels by centuries. Jesus uses that exact title to describe himself repeatedly. Without Enoch, the phrase appears from nowhere. With it, there is a direct lineage stretching back centuries before Christ was born. By the 5th century, the Western Church had turned against it entirely. Jerome dismissed it. Augustine ignored it. When the last Greek and Hebrew copies vanished, the Western world assumed it was gone forever. They were wrong, because 1,600 miles to the south, Ethiopian monks had been faithfully transcribing every word into Ge'ez for centuries, and they were not going to stop. When Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 Ge'ez manuscripts back to Europe in 1773, it caused, in the words of one scholar, a sensation not seen since the Reformation itself. The Western world discovered that the African Church had been holding a book quoted in their own New Testament for over 1,000 years, and the Western world had not even thought to ask. Almost every conversation about missing Bible books eventually arrives at the same place: the Council of Nicaea. Emperor Constantine convened this gathering of Christian bishops in the year 325 in what is now northwestern Turkey. Popular culture has claimed that this council voted on which books would enter the Bible and which would be destroyed. It is a powerful story. A single historical primary source. The actual record shows the council existed primarily to resolve a theological dispute over whether Jesus was eternally one with God the Father or created by him at an earlier point. Around 300 bishops attended. They produced the Nicene Creed, unified the date of Easter, and passed 20 administrative rules. No surviving record mentions any discussion of the biblical canon. What actually shaped the Western Bible was a slow process spanning centuries. Bishop Athanasius first listed the 27 books of the New Testament in 367, the Synod of Hippo in 393, and the Council of Carthage in 397 then finalized the list, real decisions, made it real councils 100 years after the Book of Enoch had already been quietly set aside. The uncomfortable truth is that every text the early church labeled dangerous shared one message: the kingdom of God lives inside every human being, and no priest or institution stands between a person and the divine. Ethiopia was never forced to suppress that message, because no one ever had enough power over Ethiopia to make them try. In 1946, a Bedouin shepherd near the western shore of the Dead Sea threw a stone into a cave and heard something shatter. What he found inside that cave, and in 11 more caves explored over the following decade, shocked everyone. The desert that confirmed what Africa already knew. The shepherd found a collection of approximately 15,000 manuscript fragments representing close to 1,000 separate ancient texts. These became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they remain the most significant archaeological discovery in the history of religious scholarship on Earth. The texts were written primarily in Hebrew and Aramaic and dated from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the year 68 of the Common Era. They predated the New Testament by hundreds of years and were 1,000 years older than any previously known biblical manuscripts. Every book of the Hebrew Bible except the Book of Esther was represented among the fragments. But what stopped scholars in their tracks was what else was there. In Cave 4 alone, 11 separate Aramaic manuscript fragments of the Book of Enoch were recovered. Fragments from approximately 15 separate manuscripts of the Book of Jubilees were found across 5 different caves. These were the same texts that the Western world had dismissed as unreliable, late, or foreign for over 1,000 years. Suddenly, the case against them fell completely apart. They were not medieval Ethiopian inventions. They were not forgeries created by isolated monks. They had been copied, read, and preserved as sacred by Jewish communities in the Judean desert centuries before the birth of Christ. Scholar James Vanderkam spent years comparing the Dead Sea Scroll fragments of Jubilees against the complete Ge'ez text that Ethiopian monks had been preserving all along. His conclusion was clear. He found that the Ethiopian translation was in most respects an accurate and literally faithful rendering of the original Hebrew. In other words, monks working in stone churches in the highlands of Africa had been faithfully reproducing a text for 1,500 years, and the copies they made were still essentially faithful to the documents buried in a desert cave 2,000 years ago. The community most likely responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, a Jewish sect known as the Essenes, shared a remarkable number of practices with Ethiopian Christianity. Communal meals accompanied by a priestly blessing over bread and wine. Strict Sabbath observance, circumcision on the 8th day, detailed dietary restrictions, separation of the priesthood. Researcher Stephen Kaplan noted that if you met an Ethiopian Christian man who observed the Sabbath, was circumcised at 8 days old, and refused to eat pork, there would be a 99% chance he was a Christian. The overlap between the Dead Sea community and the Ethiopian church is not coincidence. It is evidence of an unbroken thread of practice that Western scholarship overlooked for decades. The AI named after the Book of Enoch has now given us dates proving these texts are even older than the Dead Sea Scrolls originally suggested. Every layer of the story keeps pointing back to the same place. The words written before the world looked like this. There is a passage inside the Book of the Covenant, the text describing the 40-day teaching period of Jesus after his resurrection, that researchers working with modern analytical tools have flagged as carrying an unusual precision in its description of conditions that would mark a spiritually hollow era. The text describes a time when love would disappear from the earth, when faith would become performance, when religion would grow loud, bright, and spectacular on the outside, while remaining completely empty within, when crowds would fill golden buildings and shout holy names with hearts that held nothing at all. The scholars who read those passages did not need an artificial intelligence to feel the weight of them. Dr. Ephraim Isaac was born in 1936 in Walaga, Ethiopia, to a father who was a Yemenite rabbi and a mother who was a Romo. He became the first Ethiopian student ever admitted to Harvard Divinity School. He became the first Ethiopian to receive a PhD from Harvard University. He founded the Institute of Semitic Studies in Princeton, New Jersey, the first and only independent institution in the United States dedicated solely to the study of ancient Semitic languages and cultures. He also produced the standard English translation of the Book of Enoch in 1983, a translation that remains the definitive academic edition used by scholars today. When he first arrived at Harvard Divinity School, he discovered that there was not a single course in the entire curriculum on Ethiopian church history or on classical Ge'ez literature. The oldest, most complete Christian manuscript tradition in the world was entirely absent from one of the most prestigious religious institutions the Western world had ever built. He has described 1st Enoch as the most important non-canonical apocalypse for students of the New Testament. The Western Academy received that judgment politely, and then continued largely ignoring the tradition that had preserved the book. What the artificial intelligence systems of 2025 have actually done is not discover hidden truths. They have confirmed old ones at a scale and precision that human scholarship alone could not have achieved in any reasonable time frame. The Enoch dating model pushed the origins of these texts deeper into history than scientists had previously dared to claim. A separate AI study from Duke University used language analysis tools to identify 3 distinct scribal traditions across the earliest books of the Hebrew Bible, a question scholars had argued about for generations that a machine resolved in a matter of days. But the real story is not about the machines. It is about who the machines keep confirming was right all along. Ethiopia was never colonized. After the Battle of Adwa in 1896, the first time an African army had decisively defeated a European colonial force, Ethiopia remained the only nation on the continent whose land was never permanently taken. And because its land was never taken, its scriptures were never edited by the same forces that shaped the Bible everywhere else. The canon that Ethiopian monks guarded was the canon they had always had, untouched by the councils that voted in Rome, unaffected by the power struggles that shaped Western Christianity. Preserved in a language nobody else was speaking, in buildings carved out of solid rock, by men who had no reason to believe the outside world would ever care what they were doing. The Book of the Covenant does not end its warning in despair. It carries a promise alongside the warning. It says that in the midst of that hollow time, the Spirit would move through places that organized religion could not reach, that the proud would not see it, that the broken would, that it would be known not through words alone, but through fire, and that this fire would not be destruction. It would be the burning away of every false version of things, so that the truer and older version could finally be seen clearly. The oldest artificial intelligence in this story was a monk with a reed pen and a candle. The newest one was named after the book that monk refused to let the world forget. The distance between them is 1,600 years. The message they point toward is exactly the same. Drop a comment and tell us whether you think these 22 books should be restored to every Bible edition printed in the world, and how you feel knowing that one African nation preserved what the rest of Christianity lost.